This happened in Russia in the early 1960s. I was probably 3 years old. That summer, I was visiting my Russian grandparents in their provincial little Russian town, about 200 kilometers east of Moscow, where they lived. And my grandfather, Vasily, had a beautiful orchard full of exotic apple trees that he was cultivating, and he was selling those very tasty, delicious apples at the local market at a great profit to himself, and therefore took great care of his orchard. I was coming every summer to visit my Russian grandparents from Latvia, Riga, where I lived with my parents. And Russia, for me, at that time, it still is today, was a very exotic place. And life in that provincial Russian town was so different from the life we led in the capital of Latvia, Riga. We lived in large multi-story socialist tenements with running water, flush toilets, propane gas stoves, refrigerators, and they lived in Russia in wooden houses with gardens and orchards, with livestock and outhouses, well water. All that was very, very interesting for me, and I enjoyed my Russian summers greatly. That summer, grandfather Vasily underwent surgery to remove some of the German shrapnel that he received in his legs during the World War II. And he was weakened by the surgery and was on crutches and could not protect his precious orchard from the village boys that were jumping over the fence at night to steal his precious apples. Usually he would sleep in a tent with a shotgun loaded with salt, and he was saying that if you receive a lot of salt from my shotgun in your ass, you'll never come back to steal my apples. But he could not maintain this guard duty at that time, and instead he bought somewhere this giant dog by name Gypsy. It was some kind of overgrown German shepherd, but pitch black and vicious. And the name Gypsy was very symbolic for Russians because gypsies were perceived to be dark and dangerous. And this dog was really dangerous because first of all, it was trained to attack children specifically, because these were main culprits who were stealing people's apples or other fruit from their gardens. Secondly, grandfather kept it half hungry all the time, and the dog was angry and was barking and prancing and was not a happy dog. At night, grandfather would set it free in a garden, and then it would come back in the morning, and he would give it a little food, and not too much food, so it was never happy. To me, a little me, this was a very peculiar animal that I never seen back in Latvia, because in Latvia we had all these pedigree dogs, beautiful dogs to behold, but Gypsy was this wild beast that, and I like to go nightly to feed Gypsy with grandfather, because it was like going to the zoo to look at something very strange and peculiar. That night, as always, grandfather and I prepared Gypsy's food, and we went into the courtyard to the cage where Gypsy was kept during the day to serve him his food. grandfather opened the gate. I placed the dish of food in front of Gypsy. Gypsy was attached to a chain, but seeing us, he became very agitated and started jumping and prancing in our direction. And as the grandfather was closing the gate of the cage, Gypsy broke off the chain and went straight for us. He threw grandfather with his scratches onto the ground and then jumped on me, threw me on the ground too, and put one of his paws on my little forehead and started eating my right leg, my thigh. And it was a small thigh of a 3-year-old child, so he's tearing it and shredding it to pieces. The pain was excruciating. The terror was incomparable. Grandfather was laying there and screaming, and I still remember his screams, "Marusia, Marusia," calling his wife, my saintly Russian grandmother Maria, out from the house to help us. And I remember the dog standing above me, and like something giant, this overwhelming force and pain. And I remember the screams. Grandmother was doing something in the kitchen, and she could have easily not hear our screams, but by some convergence of cosmic events, she was attuned, and she either sensed that something was happening outside that needed her help, or heard our screams. She ran out, she saw what's happening, she ran towards me, she unclenched Gypsy's teeth from my leg, threw him back into the cage, closed the gate, picked me up and carried me 6 blocks to the hospital, which was fortunately not that far away. And she was bleeding herself because Gypsy beat her hands and arms. She brought me into the hospital. They immediately gave me 16 shots of anti-rabies vaccine into my stomach. I was bleeding. My leg was horribly mangled, and the doctors looked at it and they just didn't know what really to do with it, because it was so badly damaged that they thought maybe they have to amputate it. But before doing anything drastic, they decided to call Dr. Korzhev. Dr. Korzhev was this main surgeon at that hospital, and he had a private telephone line, as an unusual thing in that little provincial town at that time. They called him, and he was at home. He immediately arrived, and he brought with him special thread that he made out of the parachute. And parachutes are made of silk, so it was a special silken thread that he made himself. He was a military surgeon who learned his skill, his surgical skill during World War II, patching together all these horribly mangled human bodies shot up by shrapnel and full of bullets. And he was a very skillful surgeon. And mind you, we are in the depth of Russia in the early 60s. There is no antibiotics in that hospital, no advanced painkillers. All that they had to actually to treat me was alcohol, peroxide, and some antibacterial ointment. Dr. Korzhev arrives, he looks at my leg and says, "Yeah, it's badly damaged. It is really, it will be hard to put it together, but I can do it." And he uses his silken thread that he made himself out of parachute, and he sews up my leg, puts it all together, and he does some incredible work on it. There is no permanent damage, there is no nerve damage, the leg is totally functional, and he works like a jeweler or a watchmaker, just does this incredible work. And every day after I was patched up by him, he would come to our house to change my bandages and to wash my leg with peroxide. And in about 6 weeks I was probably okay and was running in the street. My leg still has horrible scars, but it is fully functional, thanks to Dr. Korzhev. In the morning, when I returned from the hospital, there was a party in our courtyard. Grandma, with her bandaged hands, set up a table beneath the window of our living room, piled up all the traditional Russian uh, foods that to accompany vodka, pickles, pickled mushrooms, boiled potatoes, ham, herring, sausage, and they brought me to the window to partake in a party, so I could enjoy the view. And the party was dedicated to my recovery. The men gathered in a courtyard to drink up to my recovery, and also to execution of the dog Gypsy. And they were planning to shoot it. And they were waiting for Uncle Nikolai, a friend of my grandfather's, who had this very special rifle that they wanted to use to shoot the dog. Uncle Nikolai was also a war veteran. In the war, he lost half of his foot. He was an invalid. He had a bad heart, but he had this precious special rifle that they wanted to use. Eventually, he arrived and also had a few shots of vodka with other men, with my grandfather, and toasted to my recovery. And then they toasted to shooting of the dog. And then I see that a group of men is gravitating towards the cage where Gypsy is being held. And Uncle Nikolai takes the rifle and he tries to push it through the planks of the cage where Gypsy is sitting. And the gap between the planks of the cage, the gaps are too narrow. He cannot put the muzzle of the rifle through the planks. So he tries this approach and that approach. It cannot shoot the dog through the planks. So then they come to the gate. They open the gate. Uncle Nikolai takes an aim at Gypsy. Gypsy is attached to the chain, but somehow the dog probably senses that something bad is going to happen to it, and he jumps towards Uncle Nikolai, again breaks the chain and goes straight for Uncle Nikolai's crotch. He attaches himself to Uncle Nikolai's crotch. Uncle Nikolai drops the rifle, falls down. The men tear off Gypsy from the Uncle Nikolai's crotch, throw him back in the cage, close the gate, start carrying Uncle Nikolai to the hospital. On the way to the hospital, Uncle Nikolai, who had a weak heart, has a heart attack and dies before he reaches the hospital. I, of course, don't know this. I've seen the commotion, and then when the dog attack happened, they carried me back into the bedroom where I was kept until my recovery. So the only thing I knew that I couldn't hear Gypsy barking anymore in a garden and in his cage, and Uncle Nikolai wasn't coming anymore. So when I was able already to walk, I was playing in the street with the boys, and I asked them, like, why Uncle Nikolai is not coming? Where is he? He said, oh, what, you don't know? Oh, the dog bit him in the balls and he had a heart attack and he died. Well, I was rather shocked by this news and was upset also to learn that Gypsy was shot. But my recovery was speedy and I was enjoying the rest of the summer. Kind of forgot about those events. And then my parents came from Latvia to pick me up, and they weren't told that all this happened, and they were terrified to see my scars, and nobody ever mentioned Uncle Nikolai again. And my grandfather never purchased another dog to protect his precious orchard. But I loved going to Russia after that. I really enjoyed my Russian summers, but I developed this kind of feeling about Russia that I still have until this day. that anything can happen at any time, absolutely anything at any time.